In the vast expanse of the Caribbean Sea, where azure waters meet the horizon, a single vessel became the flashpoint for a confrontation that could ignite the tinderbox of global conflict. On December 10, 2025, United States forces intercepted and seized the Venezuelan oil tanker Skipper, a massive ship laden with nearly 2 million barrels of crude oil, valued at up to $100 million. This act, justified by the U.S. as a strike against illicit smuggling and terrorism financing, was denounced by Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro as outright piracy, an imperial theft that harkens back to centuries of foreign domination. As troops mobilized along Venezuela's borders and U.S. warships patrolled nearby waters, the world watched a superpower engage in what many experts describe as a perilous wager, escalating tensions with a resource-rich nation backed by adversaries like Russia and China. This is the story of the United States and a dangerous gamble toward global war, a narrative woven from historical grievances, economic imperatives, and strategic miscalculations. It begins not with the seizure itself, but with the deep-rooted ties that once bound these two nations, only to fray into antagonism over decades of shifting alliances and ideological clashes. To understand this unfolding crisis, we must first delve into the foundations of U.S.-Venezuela relations, assuming no prior familiarity with the geopolitical landscape of Latin America. Venezuela, a South American nation roughly the size of Texas and California combined, sits atop the world's largest proven oil reserves, over 300 billion barrels, more than Saudi Arabia. Oil is not just an economic asset, it is the lifeblood of the Venezuelan economy, accounting for nearly all of its export revenue. The United States, as the world's largest oil consumer, has long relied on imports to fuel its industries, vehicles, and military. Trade between nations is governed by agreements, tariffs, taxes on imported goods, and sanctions, which are penalties imposed to restrict economic activity as a form of pressure. Sanctions can target individuals, companies, or entire sectors, often enforced through international banking systems to isolate a country financially. The relationship between the U.S. and Venezuela was once one of close alliance, forged during the Cold War era, a period from the late 1940s to the early 1990s when the United States and the Soviet Union competed for global influence without direct warfare. In the 1950s, Venezuela was a staunch anti-communist partner, its democratic government aligning with Washington against leftist movements in Latin America. A pivotal incident in 1958 underscored this bond. During a visit by U.S. Vice President Richard Nixon, his motorcade was attacked by protesters in Caracas, angry over U.S. support for a deposed Venezuelan dictator. The U.S. responded by mobilizing military forces, including an aircraft carrier task force, to signal readiness to defend its interests. This event not only strengthened ties but also highlighted the strategic importance of Venezuelan oil, which began flowing in massive quantities to American refineries. By the 1960s and 1970s, under presidents like John F. Kennedy and Ronald Reagan, the U.S. sold advanced weaponry to Venezuela, including fighter jets such as the F-4 Phantom and F-16s. Venezuela was hailed as a model democracy in the region, a counterweight to communist Cuba. Oil companies like ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips operated extensively in Venezuela, extracting and refining crude under favorable terms. Even after Venezuela nationalized its oil industry in 1976, taking control from foreign firms, the process was orderly, with billions in compensation paid to U.S. companies. By the late 1990s, Venezuela supplied up to 15% of U.S. oil imports, making it a top supplier and fostering economic interdependence. This harmony shattered with the rise of Hugo Chavez, a former military officer who won the presidency in 1998 on a platform of socialism and anti-imperialism. Chavez, viewing the U.S. as a meddlesome hegemon, a dominant power exerting undue influence, redirected oil revenues towards social programs for the poor, while forging alliances with U.S. adversaries like Cuba, Iran, and Russia. In 2002, a brief coup ousted Chavez, with evidence suggesting U.S. knowledge of the plot, though Washington denied direct involvement. Chavez was reinstated amid popular protests, but the episode deepened his paranoia and hostility. He nationalized foreign oil assets in 2007, forcing companies like ExxonMobil to accept minority stakes or exit, leading to arbitration disputes worth billions. Chavez's rhetoric escalated, labeling the U.S. an empire and using oil as a geopolitical tool, offering discounted supplies to allies while cutting ties with American firms. After Chavez's death in 2013 from cancer, his protégé Nicolás Maduro assumed power. Maduro inherited a crumbling economy. Why? Plagued by hyperinflation where prices skyrocket uncontrollably, eroding savings and purchasing power and corruption. Oil production plummeted from over 3 million barrels per day to under 1 million due to mismanagement, lack of investment, and U.S. sanctions imposed starting in 2017 under President Trump. These sanctions targeted Venezuela's state oil company, PDVSA, accusing it of funding Maduro's authoritarian regime, which suppressed dissent through arrests, media control, and electoral manipulation. The U.S. recognized opposition leader Juan Guaido as interim president in 2019, a move supported by over 50 countries but ultimately ineffective as Maduro retained control with military loyalty and foreign backing. The sanctions regime is a form of economic warfare. By blocking access to U.S. financial systems, they prevent Venezuela from selling oil easily, borrowing money, or importing goods. Maduro responded by turning to shadow fleets, unregistered tankers that disguise their origins using tactics like turning off tracking systems or falsifying documents to smuggle oil to buyers like China and Iran. This illicit trade, estimated at hundreds of millions annually, funds the regime and allegedly supports terrorist groups, including Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps (IRGC) and Hezbollah. The U.S. labels these networks as threats to national security, justifying enforcement actions like vessel seizures. Now let us break down the events of 2025 step by step, focusing on the second Trump administration's aggressive posture which has propelled this crisis to the brink. Donald Trump, re-elected in November 2024 and inaugurated on January 20, 2025, campaigned on a hardline stance against migration, drug trafficking, and leftist regimes in Latin America. Venezuela, source of millions of migrants fleeing economic collapse, over 7 million have left since 2014, many heading to the U.S. border, became a prime target. Trump blamed Maduro for exacerbating the U.S. fentanyl crisis, linking Venezuelan ports to drug cartels like the Cartel de los Soles, allegedly run by regime insiders. In August 2025, the U.S. initiated a military buildup in the Caribbean, deploying the USS Gerald R. Ford carrier strike group, equipped with F-35 fighter jets and over 4,000 sailors. Joined by the USS Wasp amphibious assault ship carrying 4,500 Marines, nuclear submarines, and drone squadrons, this force totaled 10,000 to 12,000 personnel. Officially framed as enhanced anti-narcotics operations under the U.S. Southern Command, the deployment included exercises simulating interdictions and strikes. Trump stated publicly that these assets would knock out drug shipments, claiming each intercepted vessel saves thousands of lives. Behind the scenes, the Central Intelligence Agency (CIA) received authorization in October 2025 for covert operations inside Venezuela, potentially including lethal actions against regime figures tied to narcotics. The escalation intensified on December 10, 2025 with the seizure of the Skipper. This tanker, flagged in Panama but owned by interests linked to Iran and Venezuela, was intercepted in international waters near the Venezuelan coast. U.S. officials accused it of smuggling Iranian oil under false pretenses, using automatic identification system (AIS), spoofing, faking its location to evade detection, and funding terrorist entities like the IRGC and Hezbollah. The ship carried 1.9 million barrels of crude, destined for undisclosed buyers. Homeland Security investigations agents boarded the vessel, detaining the crew and towing it to U.S. waters near Galveston, Texas for forfeiture proceedings, a legal process to confiscate assets tied to crimes. Maduro's response was immediate and vehement. In a nationally televised address, he condemned the action as international piracy and theft, mobilizing 200,000 troops along Venezuela's borders and coasts. He accused Trump of seeking regime change to plunder Venezuela's resources, invoking historical U.S. interventions like the 1989 Panama invasion. Allies rallied. Cuba labeled the seizure a violation of maritime law, Nicaragua offered military support, and Russia and China issued statements backing Maduro, warning against U.S. unilateralism. China, Venezuela's largest creditor with over $60 billion in loans repaid via oil, has a vested interest in stable shipments. Undeterred, Trump announced on December 15 a complete blockade of sanctioned oil tankers entering or leaving Venezuelan waters. This policy, enforced by naval patrols, led to the interception of a second vessel on December 20 and pursuit of a third by December 21. Sanctions expanded to Maduro's family members and linked companies, with Trump doubling the bounty on Maduro to $50 million for information leading to his arrest on narco-terrorism charges. In a White House briefing, Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem stated His seizures aimed to force Maduro from power, tying them to broader goals of curbing migration and drugs. By December 23, tensions peaked with reports of Venezuelan forces conducting live-fire drills near the Colombian border, while U.S. drones conducted reconnaissance overflights. Trump warned Maduro not to play tough, hinting at land strikes against drug facilities inside Venezuela. Such strikes would mark a significant escalation, potentially involving special forces or airstrikes without congressional approval, justified under anti-terrorism laws. Hidden or less discussed factors add layers to this gamble. First, oil remains the core motivator. With global prices hovering around $80 per barrel amid Middle East instability, Venezuela's untapped reserves represent a prize for U.S. firms. Trump's America First energy policy seeks to revive domestic production while securing foreign supplies, potentially through regime change that installs a pro-U.S. government. Critics argue this echoes the 2003 Iraq invasion, driven by oil under the guise of security. Second, domestic politics play a role. Trump's base demands action on border security. Venezuelan migrants, numbering over 500,000 arrivals in 2025 alone, fuel anti-immigration rhetoric. Linking Maduro to fentanyl, despite evidence showing most drugs enter via Mexico, provides a narrative for military posturing. Third, Iran's involvement complicates matters. The skipper's ties to Tehran, part of a ghost fleet evading sanctions, link this to broader U.S.-Iran hostilities. Seizing vessels could provoke Iranian retaliation in the Strait of Hormuz, a choke point for 20% of global oil. Fourth, alliances heighten risks. Russia's military presence in Venezuela, advisors and equipment since 2019 could lead to direct confrontation. China, with economic stakes, might respond with trade reprisals or cyber operations. The Organization of American States, OAS, is divided, with some members supporting U.S. pressure but others fearing instability. Globally, the implications are staggering. A U.S.-Venezuela conflict could disrupt oil markets, spiking prices and triggering recessions in import-dependent economies like Europe and Asia. Migration waves might overwhelm neighbors like Colombia and Brazil, straining humanitarian systems. Involvement of Russia and China risks proxy warfare, echoing Cold War dynamics in Latin America. For the U.S., overextension amid commitments in Ukraine, the Middle East, and Asia could erode military readiness. Environmentally, spills from seized tankers threaten Caribbean ecosystems, while regime change might lead to civil war, as seen in Libya post-2011. Broader trends emerge. The return of gunboat diplomacy, where naval power enforces policy, harkens to 19th-century imperialism. Trump's transactional approach, demanding concessions for relief, tests alliances, potentially isolating the U.S. if escalations backfire. In this thoughtful conclusion, we confront the precariousness of the U.S. gamble. What began as sanctions enforcement has morphed into a high-stakes confrontation, where miscalculation could spiral into war. The seizure of the skipper and subsequent blockades reflect a bold strategy to dismantle Maduro's regime, but they overlook Venezuela's resilience and international backing. History warns of such wagers. The 1958 Nixon incident resolved peacefully, but the 2002 coup fueled decades of enmity. For global stability, de-escalation through diplomacy, perhaps mediated by the UN or Brazil, offers a path forward, addressing root causes like corruption and poverty without force. Yet as warships shadow tankers and rhetoric sharpens, one truth endures. In an interconnected world, unilateral actions risk collective peril. The United States, in pursuing dominance, may unwittingly hasten the multipolar disorder it seeks to prevent. This crisis, unfolding in real time, serves as a sobering reminder that the line between leverage and catastrophe is perilously thin. Whether it leads to war or retreat will define not just U.S. foreign policy, but the fragile peace of our era. As December 23, 2025 approaches, the confrontation between the United States and Venezuela has reached a precarious intensity, with naval forces patrolling international waters and multiple oil tankers intercepted in rapid succession. The seizure of the skipper on December 10, carrying nearly 2 million barrels of Venezuelan crude, marked the beginning of a bold enforcement campaign. It was followed by the boarding and apprehension of the Centuries on December 20, and the active pursuit of additional vessels, including the Bella One, as recently as December 22. President Donald Trump has framed these actions as essential to combat narcoterrorism and illicit oil trade, while announcing a blockade targeting sanctioned tankers entering or leaving Venezuelan ports. Venezuela has responded with vehement denunciations, mobilizing its military and appealing. G to international bodies as allies like Russia and China voice strong support for Caracas. This escalating standoff, rooted in long-standing grievances over oil, sanctions, and regime legitimacy, carries profound risks of miscalculation that could draw in broader powers and destabilize the region. To contextualize these developments, consider the essential dynamics of U.S.-Venezuela relations and the role of oil in global affairs. Venezuela possesses the world's largest proven oil reserves, exceeding 300 billion barrels, making its crude a strategic commodity. Oil exports generate the vast majority of Venezuela's foreign revenue, funding government operations in a nation plagued by economic contraction and hyperinflation. Sanctions are economic restrictions imposed by one country on another, often freezing assets, prohibiting trade, or limiting access to financial systems like those dominated by the U.S. dollar. These measures aim to alter behavior without direct military engagement, though enforcement can involve naval interdictions in international waters. Historical ties between the U.S. and Venezuela were once cooperative, with American companies heavily invested in extraction and refining during much of the 20th century. Venezuela supplied significant volumes to U.S. markets, fostering mutual dependence. This shifted dramatically under Hugo Chavez, who pursued socialist policies, nationalized foreign assets, and aligned with U.S. adversaries. Nicolás Maduro, Chávez's successor, faced intensifying U.S. sanctions starting in 2017, accused of corruption, human rights abuses, and links to drug trafficking. The U.S. indicted Maduro in 2020 on narco-terrorism charges, offering rewards for information leading to his capture, raised to $50 million in August 2025. The Trump administration's second term has pursued an aggressive posture, linking Venezuela to U.S. domestic challenges like migration and fentanyl inflows, though evidence primarily traces the latter to routes through Mexico. Military deployments began escalating in August 2025 under Operation Southern Spear, initially justified as counter-narcotics efforts. Assets include the USS Gerald R. Ford carrier strike group, amphibious ships, destroyers, submarines, and thousands of personnel, totaling over 12,000 by December. These forces have conducted strikes on suspected drug vessels, resulting in dozens of fatalities and supported Coast Guard interdictions. Step by step, the crisis intensified through the fall and winter months. In September and October, airstrikes targeted alleged smuggling boats, with the administration characterizing operators as terrorists. November saw diplomatic overtures, including reported calls between Trump and Maduro, but no breakthrough. The pivotal moment arrived on December 10 with the skipper's seizure. This Panama flag tanker, previously sanctioned for ties to Iranian networks, loaded crude at Venezuela's José terminal and was intercepted in international waters. U.S. personnel, including Coast Guard and Special Forces, boarded via helicopter, executing a federal warrant. The cargo, valued at tens of millions, was towed to U.S. ports, with officials citing evasion of sanctions and funding for designated terrorist organizations. Venezuela condemned the action as piracy, mobilizing forces and issuing warnings. Trump, undeterred, expanded sanctions on December 11, targeting Maduro's associates and additional vessels. By December 16, he announced a total and complete blockade of sanctioned oil tankers, emphasizing enforcement through existing naval presence. This led to the Century's apprehension on December 20, a vessel not individually sanctioned but carrying Venezuelan crude destined for Asia. Crew cooperation facilitated boarding, though Venezuela decried it as theft. On December 22, pursuit of the Bella 1, a sanctioned tanker approaching Venezuela empty, underscored ongoing operations. As of December 23, Venezuelan exports have sharply declined, with many tankers lingering in ports to avoid risk. Chevron's authorized shipments continue unaffected, but shadow fleet operations using spoofing and false flags face heightened scrutiny. Maduro has ordered naval escorts for select vessels and appealed to the United Nations Security Council. Less discussed factors illuminate the stakes. Oil markets have reacted modestly, with prices rising slightly amid supply concerns, though global inventories mitigate immediate shocks. Domestic U.S. politics influence the campaign, addressing migration from Venezuela and framing actions as anti-drug measures resonate with certain constituencies. Iran's involvement in some tankers ties this to broader Middle East tensions, risking retaliation elsewhere. China's role as primary buyer, absorbing most Venezuelan crude, introduces potential for economic countermeasures, given Beijing's investments and loans to Caracas. Russia's military advisors in Venezuela. ND vocal support raise proxy risks. Legal debates persist. While interdictions of sanctioned vessels align with enforcement precedents, broader blockades historically constitute acts of war under international law absent congressional authorization. Global implications are multifaceted. Disruptions could elevate energy costs, affecting import-dependent economies. Migration pressures may intensify if Venezuela's economy contracts further. Regional stability hangs in balance, with neighbors like Colombia monitoring border activities. Involvement of major powers, Russia providing defense support, China economic lifelines, evokes great power competition, potentially complicating U.S. commitments elsewhere. Environmentally, risks include spills from interdicted vessels in sensitive Caribbean waters. Diplomatically, divisions emerge in forums like the Organization of American States. In this extended reflection, as 2025 concludes, the U.S. gamble reveals the perils of coercive escalation in an interdependent world. Interdictions and blockades aim to erode Maduro's revenue, compelling concessions or collapse, yet Venezuela's resilience, through alternative buyers and alliances, suggests prolonged standoff. Trump's approach, blending law enforcement with military signaling, tests limits of unilateral action, echoing historical interventions with mixed outcomes. De-escalation pathways exist, mediated talks addressing sanctions relief for electoral reforms or humanitarian channels. Yet rhetoric from both sides hardens positions. The seizures, while tactically successful, carry strategic hazards. Missteps could provoke direct clashes or wider alliances against U.S. moves. For global order, this crisis underscores fragility when economic pressure meets determined resistance. Sustainable resolution demands pragmatism over confrontation, recognizing that shared hemispheric interests in stability, migration management, and energy security transcend ideological divides. As forces remain deployed and tankers navigate uncertain waters, the wager's outcome will shape not only bilateral ties but the contours of power in a contested era. As December 23, 2025 dawns, the United States enforcement campaign against Venezuelan oil shipments has intensified with the pursuit of a third tanker, the Bella 1, in international waters near the Venezuelan coast. This follows the successful interdictions of the Skipper on December 10 and the Centuries on December 20, operations that have sharply curtailed Venezuela's crude exports and drawn international condemnation. President Donald Trump has characterized these actions as vital to disrupting illicit trade networks funding narcoterrorism, while Venezuelan authorities denounce them as acts of piracy and threats to sovereignty. With naval assets maintaining a robust presence in the Caribbean and diplomatic channels strained, this escalating pressure campaign underscores the high-stakes risks inherent in coercive economic measures against a resilient adversary backed by global powers. To situate these recent developments, recall the long-standing economic and strategic dimensions of U.S.-Venezuela interactions. Venezuela holds the planet's largest proven oil reserves, a resource that sustains its government through export revenues amid profound domestic challenges like hyperinflation and shortages. Sanctions represent targeted restrictions, freezing assets, barring transactions in U.S. dollars, or prohibiting trade with specific entities, to compel policy changes without overt conflict. The U.S. has applied such measures progressively since 2017, focusing on the state oil firm PDVSA and individuals accused of corruption or human rights violations. Shift toward direct enforcement emerged under the second Trump administration, framing Venezuela as a source of migration pressures and drug inflows. Military deployments under Operation Southern Spear expanded through 2025, incorporating carrier groups, amphibious vessels, and support units totaling thousands of personnel. These assets facilitated initial strikes on suspected smuggling boats, transitioning to tanker interdictions as a means to starve regime finances. The sequence unfolded with precision and mounting assertiveness. The Skipper, a very large crude carrier sanctioned for prior Iranian oil transports, was boarded on December 10 after loading at Venezuela's Jose terminal. Equipped with a judicial warrant, U.S. Coast Guard teams supported by naval helicopters executed the operation without resistance. The cargo, approximately 1.9 million barrels, reached U.S. waters for offloading, marking the first seizure of Venezuelan crude since sanctions began. Venezuela's vehement response labeled it piracy, prompting mobilization and appeals to multilateral forums. Undaunted, the administration imposed additional sanctions on related vessels and individuals. On December 17, Trump declared a blockade targeting sanctioned tankers, expanding in 4. Cement scope. This precipitated the Century's apprehension on December 20, a Panama-flagged vessel carrying Venezuelan oil despite lacking individual sanctions. Crew cooperation enabled boarding, though the action highlighted broadening criteria, sanctioned cargo itself sufficing for intervention. By December 22, pursuit of the Bella 1, a sanctioned tanker en route to load crude, demonstrated ongoing vigilance. Flying a false flag and subject to a seizure order, it evaded immediate capture, illustrating operational challenges in vast maritime spaces. As of December 23, Venezuelan exports have plummeted, with numerous loaded vessels idling in ports to mitigate risks. Authorized flows such as Chevrons proceed uninterrupted, but shadow fleet activities face severe constraints. Less examined aspects reveal nuanced motivations and repercussions. Judicial warrants underpin seizures, grounding them in legal processes rather than unilateral force, though critics argue expansions strain international maritime norms. Market reactions remain contained, with ample global supplies buffering price spikes, yet prolonged disruptions could strain refineries reliant on heavy Venezuelan grades. Domestic U.S. considerations addressing border arrivals and drug concerns align with the campaign's framing, while Iran's linkages in some vessels connect this to wider sanction evasion networks. China, absorbing the bulk of Venezuelan output, monitors closely, with potential for reciprocal measures given economic stakes. Russia's advisory role and equipment provisions add layers of great power involvement. Globally, ramifications span energy security, regional stability, and normative precedents. Reduced exports exacerbate Venezuela's humanitarian strains, potentially accelerating outflows. Neighboring states brace for spillover effects while multilateral bodies grapple with complaints of aggression. Legal scholars debate blockade characterizations, noting historical parallels where enforcement blurred into belligerency absent declared war. In this comprehensive appraisal concluding 2025, the U.S. campaign embodies calculated coercion aimed at regime alteration through economic denial. Interdictions have demonstrably impacted revenues, signaling resolve, yet Venezuela's adaptations, alternative buyers, fleet obfuscation attest to endurance. Trump's directives balance enforcement with escalation controls, avoiding direct strikes thus far. Risks persist. Misjudgments could provoke clashes, entangling allies or adversaries. Pathways to mitigation include calibrated diplomacy, sanctions relief tied to verifiable reforms, or third-party mediation. These events illuminate interdependence in energy flows. Actions disrupting one node reverberate broadly. Prudent stewardship demands weighing immediate gains against enduring instabilities, fostering conditions for negotiated resolutions over perpetual confrontation. As patrols continue and vessels navigate uncertain seas, the gamble's trajectory will influence hemispheric dynamics and beyond, affirming that coercive tools, potent yet double-edged, require restraint to avert unintended conflagrations. As December 23, 2025 marks the final days of a year defined by heightened geopolitical friction, the United States campaign of maritime interdictions against Venezuelan oil tankers continues unabated, with 3 vessels now seized or under active pursuit in the Caribbean basin. The Skipper, intercepted on December 10, the Centuries, boarded on December 20, and the ongoing operation involving the Bella 1 as of December 22 illustrate a systematic enforcement strategy aimed at severing the financial lifelines of the Maduro regime. President Donald Trump has repeatedly justified these actions as indispensable measures to dismantle networks funding narco-terrorism and sanctions evasion, while Venezuelan officials counter with accusations of state-sponsored piracy and violations of international law. With U.S. naval assets maintaining vigilant patrols and Venezuelan forces on heightened alert, this protracted standoff reveals the profound hazards of employing coercive economic tools against a nation fortified by alternative alliances and domestic resilience. To fully appreciate the current phase of this crisis, it is necessary to revisit the underlying structures that govern energy trade and the application of unilateral sanctions. Oil, as a fungible commodity, meaning one barrel is largely interchangeable with another, flows through complex global markets influenced by supply, demand, and political disruptions. Venezuela's heavy sour crude, rich in impurities but suitable for certain refineries, once formed a critical input for U.S. Gulf Coast facilities. Sanctions disrupt this flow by prohibiting transactions in U.S. dollars, freezing assets held abroad, and threatening secondary penalties against third parties engaging with targeted entities. Enforcement traditionally relied on financial isolation, but the 2025 shift toward physical interdictions represents a more assertive posture, blending law enforcement with military projection. The historical arc from cooperation to confrontation provides essential context. For much of the 20th century, Venezuela served as a reliable supplier to the United States, with American firms deeply embedded in extraction and infrastructure. Nationalization in the 1970s proceeded with compensation, preserving ties. The Chavez era introduced ideological rupture, redirecting revenues towards social initiatives and forging partnerships with Russia, China, and Iran. Maduro's tenure saw economic collapse, production falling from over 3 million barrels daily to under 800,000, exacerbated by mismanagement and sanctions. Efforts to circumvent restrictions through shadow fleets, vessels operating with obscured ownership, disabled transponders, and falsified documentation, sustained limited exports, primarily to Asia. The second Trump administration's approach has emphasized direct action. Military augmentation in the Caribbean commenced in mid-2025, framed initially as counternarcotics operations but evolving into broader enforcement. Carrier strike groups, amphibious-ready groups, and supporting elements established persistent presence, enabling rapid response to intelligence on tanker movements. The timeline of interdictions unfolded methodically. The Skipper operation on December 10 involved coordinated boarding in international waters, executed under a federal seizure warrant citing sanctions violations and terrorist financing links. The vessel's cargo was secured and redirected to U.S. jurisdiction. Venezuelan condemnation followed swiftly, accompanied by military mobilizations and rhetorical escalation. On December 17, Trump formalized expanded enforcement, declaring intent to intercept any tanker carrying sanctioned crude. This policy manifested in the Century's seizure on December 20, where crew compliance facilitated a non-resistant boarding despite the vessel's lack of individual designation, cargo origin sufficing as grounds. Pursuit of the Bella 1, ongoing as of December 22-23, highlights operational persistence. This sanctioned tanker, previously involved in Iranian routes, attempted evasion tactics but remained under surveillance. Venezuelan exports have consequently contracted sharply, with loaded vessels anchoring indefinitely and new loadings halted. Authorized exceptions, such as Chevron's licensed operations, continue, underscoring selective application. Hidden dimensions merit careful consideration. Judicial oversight through warrants lends legal veneer, distinguishing actions from outright blockade, historically an act of war requiring congressional declaration. Market dynamics absorb shocks thus far, with Saudi and other producers offsetting lost volumes, though prolonged constraints could strain heavy crude refiners. Domestic U.S. imperatives, migration flows, and drug narratives sustain political support despite evidentiary emphasis on Mexican transit routes for fentanyl. Iran's intermittent role in tanker networks connects this theater to Persian Gulf tensions, raising prospects of asymmetric responses elsewhere. China's position as principal buyer introduces economic counter-leverage, given bilateral loans and infrastructure commitments. Russia's military advisory presence and equipment deliveries complicate potential escalations. Regional neighbors monitor spillover risks, including refugee movements and border incidents. Global consequences extend across multiple spheres. Energy price stability faces latent threats should disruptions broaden or provoke retaliation in other choke points. Humanitarian conditions in Venezuela, already dire, may deteriorate further, accelerating outflows. Precedents set for maritime enforcement could influence norms governing freedom of navigation, with implications for contested areas like the South China Sea. Multilateral institutions grapple with competing claims of sovereignty versus sanction implementation. In this measured assessment concluding 2025, the U.S. strategy reflects a deliberate gamble: economic strangulation through physical denial intended to precipitate regime crisis or concessions. Tactical successes in vessel seizures demonstrate capability, yet strategic outcomes remain uncertain against Venezuela's adaptive alliances and internal cohesion. Trump's calibrated rhetoric, emphasizing law enforcement over invasion, seeks to contain escalation, preserving options. Viable off-ramps persist. Structured negotiations linking phased sanctions relief to verifiable reforms, or neutral mediation addressing mutual grievances. These events affirm the double-edged nature of coercive instruments, potent in disruption, perilous in unintended ramifications. Sustainable hemispheric relations demand recognition of shared interests, stability, migration management, energy security over maximalist pursuits, as now. Al vigilance endures and diplomatic overtures remain limited. The crisis serves as a sobering testament to the fragility of peace when economic warfare meets determined resistance. Prudent leadership requires tempering resolve with foresight, lest tactical assertions yield strategic reversals in an interconnected global order.